Hello everyone, Luke here, and Nintendo's made some amazing consoles over the years, some that millions adore, that have brought fun games and enjoyable experiences. One of those being the Nintendo 64. It was Nintendo's first jump to 3D and their first big mess up. The PlayStation 1 tripled the Nintendo 64 sales, which is crazy. Nintendo's previous systems won their respective generations, so what went wrong here? Was it even Nintendo's fault, or was it something else entirely?
The Nintendo 64. So much was done right, but yet so much was just done so wrong. I don't hate this thing. There's been some great games and some great ideas packed into this box, but just something about the Nintendo 64 just isn't right. And today I'm going to figure out what that is. It's the early 90s. Video game companies have just made 3D video games, so there's a big race to make a 3D console. Sony said why not and made the PS1, and, well, looking at the sales, they never looked back. The PS1 came out in December 3rd, 1994. Nintendo needed a bit of time as the Nintendo 64 wouldn't come out for another 2 years, so they made the Virtual Boy in 1995, kind of as a placeholder for a bit, so they could say that they had a 3D console, but everybody was waiting for a true 3D console, because the Virtual Boy for the time was impressive, but man, no head strap, two colors, some strange commercials, and the lack of good games and the headaches. Living in 3D, just waking up some days is hard, but I could not imagine playing Mario Tennis 2.
The Virtual Boy flopped, which, whatever, people knew Nintendo was working on their next console. That would be actual competition against the PlayStation 1, the PS1 being the first PlayStation system. Now, why was Nintendo's system called the Nintendo 64?
For someone looking at the system today, it might seem pretty misleading. Like, if we're looking at a game like Mario 64, is this the 64th Mario game? Let me answer that no. What does the 64 in the name mean? Bits. The 64 in the name refers to bits. Now, what is a bit? A bit refers to the CPU word size, which back then, instead of things like central processing units or data storage designs and things like that, how many bits a system was a big selling point. The NES had 8 bits, the Super Nintendo had 16 bits, and the Virtual Boy had 32 bits. It was all leading up to their next console, the Nintendo 64, which had 64 bits. The PS1 was announced with only 32 bits, so Nintendo was really selling that this console had double the bits of the PS1. And things didn't really work out for them.
The PS1 outsold the Nintendo 64 for a few reasons, one of them being that Nintendo was stupid. Well, I mean, kind of. The PS1 came out a whole 2 years before the Nintendo 64 did, which is probably the biggest reason why the system failed. And when it did launch, it launched with two games, Mario 64 and Pilot Wing 64, so it really launched with 1.5 games. Also, this generation of consoles was the first one where CDs were really standardized. Making discs for games just had a lot of pros over using cartridges. Discs were way cheaper to produce for, could store way more data, could have way higher quality sounds. The only thing cartridges had over discs was that they were harder to pirate, so yeah, it was definitely a Nintendo.
Sticking with cartridges was not a good idea, and it sure hit Nintendo back in the sale charts. And also, even when they stuck with cartridges, they made the worst design known to man. These are not fun to store because there are no end labels and the curved top, so they stuck with cartridges, but they could have at least made them good. Now, I like how for games like Donkey Kong 64 or Majora's Mask, the standard gray is replaced, like New Super Mario Bros. Wii, where it's like a special thing that rarely happens. Like if the whole library of 64 games had their own color, that would get pretty annoying. But here, I like how it makes it stand out, but not in an annoying way. The console design. I don't know what I'm looking at here. The N64 always looked weird to me. It looks like a bear laying down with his paws or something. Now, something really cool here is that the Nintendo 64 came in many colors. They all look really cool. I own the tropical green N64. This one just looked the coolest to me. The colors really pop, and I kind of miss when consoles came in many colors. On the top of the system, we have where you can insert your game, we have an on and off switch, a reset switch, and 4 whole controller ports. Let me just follow the cord. I'm sorry, did people back in 1996 have 3 hands or what? The design of the N64 controller is really confusing. You have 3 main sections. You hold the left and the right side for 2D games, you hold the middle and right side for 3D games, and the left side and middle for non-existent games. Simple, but a bit confusing to new players. The buttons feel fine, the stick could have been better, but overall, for a controller for a design like this, I think they did about as well as they could have. Now for graphics. If there's one word to describe the visuals of the Nintendo 64, it would be interesting. For something like 16-bit games, their style is still recreated today just because it looks flat out nice. Nobody's ever tried to revive this. It doesn't look bad. Everything is just kind of blocky. Every model has jagged lines. It honestly takes a bit to get used to, but once you do, it's charming enough. After a while, you'll forget how many lines make up Mario's hat. Now for the games, and oh man, if there was any reason to get the Nintendo 64, it would be for them, and I think that's the biggest knock on the PS1. If you lock 10 random PS1 users in a room, they will probably have completely different favorite games. I'm not trying to say that the PS1 didn't have popular games that everybody knew, but there were almost 2,000 of them. There were only 296 games released for the Nintendo 64 in North America, which the lack of sales and games actually kind of helped form a community. Everybody who had a Nintendo 64 played Mario 64 and Mario Kart 64 and Ocarina of Time. With the PS1, there were so many games that everybody could have a big library for the thing and still have an entirely different library from his neighbor. Now for the games, and why not start with a game that wasn't the first 3D game, but might as well have been. Mario 64 is one of the most revolutionary games ever. 3D before Mario 64 felt like 2D games just in 3D. Mario 64 showed what a 3D game could really be. There are many levels you access by jumping through paintings. Once there, you can do missions to get stars, and the sandbox feels awesome. You can go anywhere. Sometimes I just boot up the game and don't even do any missions. I just run around the castle and have fun. This game is the reason gaming is so fun. Mario Kart 64, a big jump from Super Mario Kart on the Super Nintendo. Now in 3D with more items, interesting tracks, this was the birth of modern Mario Kart. This is a game I need to talk about someday. And man, the battle mode is so much fun. Donkey Kong 64. The opening song is a banger. I didn't get far in the actual story mode, but you need to listen to the DK rap. Also, are you noticing a pattern? Airborder 64, Asteroid Typer 64, Bass Hunter 64, Bomberman 64, Bomberman 64, The Second Attack, Sharmageddon 64, Clay Fighter 63, which was meant to be a joke at the 64 name, Destruction Derby 64, Donkey Kong 64, Doom 64, Duke Newman 64, Accept Bike 64, F1 Pole Position 64, FIFA Soccer 64, Fighting Force 64, Forsaken 64, Gex 64, Golden Nugget 64, GT 64, Harvest Moon 64, International Soccer Superstar 64, Kirby 64, Crystal Stars, Madden Football 64, Mario 64, Mario Kart 64, Mega Man 64, Machines 64, Turbo Monster Truck Madness 64, Necro Museum 64, Nuclear Strike 64, Ogre Battle 64, Person of the Lordy, Cabler, Paperboy 64, Pilot Mix 64, Quake 64, Quest 64, Ridge Racer 64, Road Rush 64, Arbitron 64, Shadow Age 64, Star Fox 64, StarCraft 64, Super Mario 64, Virtual Chess 64, Virtual Pool 64, World Race 64, Wild Ball 64.
Well, I'm lightheaded. A lot of games use the 64 in their title just so people could know what system it was for, but a lot of games really didn't need the 64 in the name. Like Kirby 64, The Crystal Shards. Why does the 64 exist? You already have the subtitle. Why not call Kirby The Crystal Shards? Like, okay, I'm just complaining. It doesn't really matter. Let's just get on with the video.
Mario Party got its start here. It got 3 whole entries on the system. Now, the first one was unfair, but kind of in a fun way. 2 was a masterpiece, and 3 I haven't played. Mario Sports also had its start here. However, I feel Mario Sports really peaked in the GameCube era. Those games were just more wacky, but the 64 entries started the Mario Sports genre, so I can't really complain too much. And GoldenEye, it really showed what a first-person shooter could be. It was still very basic looking at it today, and it's a bit wonky to control with only one thumbstick, but you cannot deny that it was one of the starting points for this genre of gaming.
And that was the Nintendo 64. It was a huge gaming console for innovation and iconicness. But it failed sales-wise, and it's pretty easy to see why, which honestly is kind of sad. The Nintendo 64 is not my favorite console by any means, but there's no doubt that it shaped the gaming industry into what it is today, and I'm glad that nowadays it's getting the recognition that it deserves. And as always, thanks for watching.